So just a bit of a story. I was the planning director for the Utah DOT, and Chandler called me up, what, 2 years ago, Chandler? 3 years ago?
Actually, 2016, so yeah.
Yeah, and used the word disinvestment, and of course I bristled, because in Utah we have money, we take care of our roads, we're growing, and we're building. The state basically contributes about $825 million a year to capacity building in Utah. We have an indexed gas tax that covers all of our preservation and maintenance, and we're growing and we're building. And so when I heard the disinvestment discussion, I really did bristle, because we're not disinvesting, we're investing. But it does, so I'm gonna approach right sizing from a different perspective a little bit. And I put this slide up here not just to plug Mike Brown's streetnet.com, but because I think the picture reflects the things we need to think about as we go through the discussion. So what is an asset? They asked me to review asset, right? We all think about it from a transportation perspective. You know, I was ad nauseum discussions in state DOT about pavement, bridge, then we get into culverts. Is it a type 1 or a type 2 asset, and signs, et cetera, et cetera. And so we got into those discussions, but I think our assets are, I can't see, natural, right. So I should have worn my glasses. Yeah, please, thank you. I'm getting old, I can't see far and I can't see close. But our assets are much more than just transportation assets, right? When we think about it, we've got natural assets. In Utah, for example, we have the Wasatch Front. That is a huge draw in terms of bringing the population to Utah. It's an amazing recreation asset, and we need to consider that as we're building our transportation system. Also, economic assets, right? What do our roads do? They further, they help. What does a transportation investment do, right? It helps the efficiency of business, right? Dock-to-dock time if you're a freight person. So we need to consider the economic assets. Health assets. When we build a corridor, right, we need to think about the health. One of the corridors we were building out, we actually put sampling sensors in the schools that were located next to the roadway facility. And we were able to see the differences between whether you were right next to the roadway facility, a freeway, or you were 2 blocks away. So again, we need to consider those things. Community assets, even more important. What does a community want to do? This goes back to the slide that I showed you before, is all of those things in that streetnet.com, those are all assets. The tree, the median, the building, the roadway, transit, those are all assets that we need to consider, and they should be calculated or in your calculus when you're thinking about transportation investment and right sizing. Contextual understanding, thank you, by the way. And so when we think about it, when I think about planning, and I'm a planner, so I think everything from a planning perspective, what we're trying to do is develop a contextual understanding of the environment, and then think about, okay, well, how does the transportation system need to support that contextual understanding, or that context, right? It would be different in an area that's warehouse, light industrial, distribution, as opposed to residential, commercial, retail. Different context, how does the transportation system need to function? You will have different assets. So, okay, well, how do you consider that? One of the things that I discovered as a state planning director is there is a huge gap in the planning process. When I went around to my region directors and asked them, what's the problem that you have? And they basically said, it's the gap between long-range planning and implementation. I think we've used, if I may, and hopefully this will get some pushback from the audience, use long-range planning a little in the wrong way, if you will. Long-range planning, metropolitan planning requirements are that you have a project-based plan. We cost it, we financially constrain it, we air quality conform it. But the long-range planning process is really, in my opinion, incapable of developing real solutions. Just the scope, the scale, and the tools in the long-range planning process don't lend themselves to that. And so what my region directors and my region teams were discovering is the projects that we had in the long-range plan, when they went to implement them, they didn't make sense to them in a lot of cases, right? And so there's that gap in the intermediate planning process. Mike, cue me if I'm going too long, please, because I love to talk about this stuff. So the gap in the long-range planning process. So The other component of that is Pell, planning and environmental linkages. It's, as you know, Pell has been in the federal planning regs for quite some time. There's actually 3 paths through the planning regs that allow you to take the products of the planning process and use them as the first step in the NEPA process. You can establish preliminary purpose and need, you can eliminate unreasonable alternatives, and you can begin to evaluate alternatives. But we have not effectively implemented Pell. And the reason I believe for that is because of that gap in the intermediate planning process. And there's no clear, distinct, rigorous method to actually implement Pell. And if you do that, I think you would save a great deal of money. I am going to get back to right sizing.
And just real quick, just to make sure that, I think I understand this, but I want to make sure for the audience as well, that I think that what you're getting at is that when we talk about long-range planning process, we often talk about programmatic investments. When we're talking about, are we spending the efficient amount of money on expansion, modernization, preservation? But then there's this whole other question of, are we actually putting that money in the right places at the right time? And there's this big question mark that a lot of people implementing these plans have run into.
Right, and what I'm getting to, right, is in corridors, when you lack that intermediate planning process, then you're really not developing the right solution. I go back to the contextual understanding, right? If I understand the context of the area, and then I understand the transportation system, then I can set goals, objectives, and performance measures that actually guide my investment decision. What we do in this business, correct me if I'm wrong, but we always start with the answer. I know what I need to do, right? And I usually use, at least in the West, we use congestion, delay, and reliability as our evaluation criteria and performance measures. So what do you get? Highways, roads. But if you think contextually and back up from that and don't start with the project in mind or the end in mind, Stephen Covey, please forgive me, don't start with the end in mind and approach it from the perspective of understanding contextually what we need to do, then you can develop goals, objectives, and performance measures that really allow you to develop the right solution, right size it for a given corridor in a given area. I give credit to the Utah Department of Transportation. This is they at one time we called it area corridor planning process. Andrea, I think now you're calling it solutions development process, the planning director for the Utah Department of Transportation, by the way. Sorry for calling you out, Andrea. So the unique part of this, the dark blue boxes are just corridor planning. What we did at UDOT is we established a rigorous planning, intermediate planning framework. We integrated Pell into this, but the truly remarkable part of this is the light blue at the top. Is we go into an area and we sit down with the local governments, we sit down with key stakeholders, business people, community leaders, et cetera, and we go through this process at the top. And then we do it with the public. And the idea is that you establish those goals and objectives and performance measures. In this process, there's only really one rule. You cannot talk about a project at all. If you talk about a project, we kick you out. It's about establishing those evaluation criteria / performance metrics, right? And so if you do this, the idea is that you will get a contextually based planning process. You will right size it. It will be ideal for the situation that you're trying to. I'm almost done. Solutions versus projects. Let me talk a little bit about that. Are project solutions? Sure. But we want to broaden the discussion and think about solutions as opposed to projects. And because it's getting complicated, right? Corridor solution set is the kind of the concept. And forgive me, I'm going to put you all remember this from Algebra 101. But the challenge is that, sorry, I'm going to back up. We think about a project, but if you really develop a contextually based implementation strategy for a corridor, right size it, you're going to have many aspects to the improvement of that corridor. A could be a roadway capacity project. B could be a transportation or a transit investment. Active transportation. What does that one say? Land use policy. Pricing. We did a corridor study in Utah. It was called the Wasatch Front Central Corridor Study. You can Google it. And we developed essentially 3 different scenarios. And the idea was not to offer a preferred alternative, but to present our policymakers with different investment strategies, all the way from managed travel demand to the build, baby, build scenario where we double-decked freeways, we added just massive amounts of capacity. Then we did life cycle cost analysis, economic benefit analysis, and we were able to show the opportunity costs of different investment decisions. And HDR actually helped us with that. Chris was on the project, and it was wonderful. And what we came up with was a solution set. And part of that solution set was two pricing policies, congestion pricing and low fare transit. And so it involved, and I think as the rate and type of change that we're experiencing now, the day of, am I running over? The day of just simple project solving our problem are long gone. We need to think holistically about how we invest in corridors. And I think